Right, so I thought I would start tonight by just sort of warming up, talking about what we historical linguists do with an example from English. So the example that I am going to use is the word night. And you see the sound night has two spellings in English, one with a K and one with an N. And, prima facie, maybe the one with the K was once pronounced with a K, we might hypothesize. And then I will actually first just show you this picture which Valerie took while she was in Slovenia, and her tour guide said in the morning, let's meet tomorrow at the Knijt. So, so some people, in fact, still have the K there. So if we look for evidence of when the K was still around, so using the technical term, the terminus post quem, we have this alliterative verse from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Then commanded the king the Knijt for to rise. Yeah, so the alliteration doesn't work unless the K is pronounced. So we think the K was pronounced. Yeah. On the other hand, around 100 years later, we have a letter, personal letter, and then ye and I shall accord well. I know. Yeah. So here, if he spells I know with no K, presumably he didn't pronounce the K. So this is the terminus antequem. So that gives us a sort of 100-year period to identify when the K went quiet. I'm oversimplifying the story, if any of you, feel bothered already. And then might as well take the chance to throw in some Shakespeare. So Shakespeare puns sometimes between K-N and N words. Like here we have Juliet saying, come night, come Romeo, come thou day and night, come gentle night, come loving black-browed night. So, gentle night and black-browed night maybe suggest more the K meaning. So that's a pun. And here is another pun. It is in a sort of a tense, playful conversation. Yeah? You are little better than false knaves. We say we are none. Have you writ down that they are known? Yeah, so the pun is between none and known. It works better if the K is not pronounced. Yeah. Okay, so this just gives you a little bit of a taste of the sort of thing we do as historical linguists. And now I'm going to turn to Chinese. In Chinese, things are a little more complicated because we don't use a segmental alphabet, but rather Chinese characters. So the analog to something like spelling variation, writing the word night, Knijt, without K, is using one character when, by some standard, we might expect another one. And this is called Tongjia. So then if we see these substitutions, we can presume that, for the person at the time and place where that sort of, if you like, substitution was made, those two morphemes were pronounced the same. Let's say those two words were pronounced the same. Now I turn to some homophones. So we had, in modern English, night and night are homophones. Here are two homophones, gong, which means work, and gong, which means public. That's in Chinese as pronounced today in Beijing. But actually, these words were already pronounced the same in 602. So 602 AD is the first time we have a lot of Chinese characters with their pronunciations systematically recorded in this book called the Cheiyun. And in that book, these two characters are indicated as having the same pronunciation. So if two words have the same pronunciation, we would maybe expect that sometimes a person accidentally writes one for the other, in the way we saw in the case of night and no and so on. But strangely, if you like, before the Han period, that's Han period, sort of 100 BC to 200 AD, something like that, these characters are never confused with each other. So on the left you have the characters that are substituted for the character that means work, and on the right you have the characters that are attested as substituting for the character that means public, and you see that there's no overlap. Yeah? And then we have a little network diagram that also shows you these attested Tongjia relations, and there's no link between these two networks. So, Baxter and Cigar say, well, if they couldn't be substituted, these two characters, then if the evidence is sufficiently large, if we have a sufficiently large corpus, this suggests that they had different pronunciations. But in the Peking school, and I call it Peking because it's sort of centered at Peking University, they think that it's just an accidental gap. Could be just an accidental gap. It doesn't mean anything. All right, I just get some water. So now I need to introduce a piece of technical terminology. So I take a little aside, and the technical terminology is shesheng. So a shesheng series. So in general, a Chinese character has two components. One component that indicates something about the meaning, and one component that indicates something about the pronunciation. And so I give an example here. This word bie, to cover oneself. The segment actually on the right itself is pronounced bie, and the segment on the left is the character for clothing. So the way you read this is something like, as a reader, as a reader who wouldn't know the language very well, you would actually read it as okay, it's the word for it's the word that has something to do with clothing. It's pronounced something like bie, and you could imagine, in English, if you're writing, dear mother or something, that you write like a picture of the word deer, like the animal deer, and then you put a little heart by it to say, I don't mean the animal, I mean the other meaning, yeah? So this is how most characters in Chinese work, like 90+%. Okay, so then you can put them in a series that share the same phonetic component. And here is the example with this bie, yeah? So then this is in the Middle Chinese. So in 602, the characters were mostly pronounced kind of mostly the same. And the fact that they weren't pronounced exactly the same is in part because a lot had changed between when the characters were invented and 602 AD, right? So this is we call a shesheng series, yeah, okay. So now I tell you something about Baxter and Cigar's reconstruction of Old Chinese. So Old Chinese is the earliest form of Chinese that we can reconstruct. Let's say it's from, 700 BC, something like that. Okay, so some shesheng series have pure velars. So K and G, basically, K, G, right? They're pronounced in the same place in the throat. But other shesheng series mix velars and non-velars, so they have G and G, but they also have glottal stop and fricatives like H and R and glide Ya. So they notice there are two kinds of series, those that are pure velars and those that are sort of messy velars. And they propose, following the hypothesis of Pan Wuyun, that the messy velar series come from uvulars. So uvulars, you will know from Arabic. In English, it's something like the small country of Qatar. Yeah, so that sound is a uvular. So they think these uvulars account for the mixed, the sort of messy velar series. Okay, so this is how they reconstruct the two series involving the two characters that we've been looking at. So one is a pure velar series. We see that from Middle Chinese, and they reconstruct it with velars. And the one is a kind of messy velar series, which they reconstruct as uvulars. Okay, so then they say, okay, we've proposed this reconstruction based on the shesheng series. But now it makes a prediction about Tongjia, namely that at a sufficiently early period, you would not see contact between, in terms of this kind of spelling, misspelling, spelling variation, you wouldn't see contact between these two series. And then sure enough, it's true, right? So they have a hypothesis, they test the hypothesis, and lo and behold, there is evidence that conforms with the hypothesis. Although I do want to say they're Popperians, so they would say, oh, we haven't proven anything, yeah? We've just failed to falsify our hypothesis. Yeah, so in contrast, in Peking, or I should say in Beijing, but the Peking school say this is argumentum a silencio, so they agree on the facts. Yeah? There's no spelling substitution between these two theories, but maybe tomorrow when we're building a new hotel, we'll find some bamboo slips with this substitution in it. Yeah, so it's bad scientific practice to argue from science. So we see that the disagreement is kind of a philosophical one. Yeah, and then I just want to say, I'm stylizing here. So in terms of Baxter and Cigar versus the Peking school. So here is an example of a guy from Taipei who also says interpretations should, of course, be based upon facts. Facts precede and matter more than interpretation. So he thinks this methodology of coming up with a hypothesis and then making a prediction is kind of not sufficiently empirical. Yeah. So we see there's a kind of philosophy of science issue at stake. So we have to think about the philosophy of science, and I would basically characterize the Peking school and some other people like He Dan as empiricists. So this is Francis Bacon, who's Mr. Empiricist. And I won't read the quote, but in case, I think most people know what is empiricism, and the idea is you start from the facts and you observe some patterns in the facts. Okay, whereas Baxter and Cigar are Popperians quite explicitly. I would say the Peking school are sort of implicit Baconians, whereas Baxter and Cigar are explicit Popperians. And so now I will read out the quote because to me this is the easiest point to disagree with Popper. So here we go. The question how it happens that a new idea comes to a man, whether it is a musical theme, a dramatic conflict, or a scientific theory, may be of great interest to the empirical psychologist, but is irrelevant to the logical analysis of scientific knowledge. So he really thinks like, look, if you had a demon visit you and say, maybe you should separate velars and uvulars, or whatever. Yeah? Who cares? Once you have the theory, you test the theory, and if the theory is wrong, it will be able to falsify it, and if the theory is not so wrong, it will be hard to falsify it. Yeah? And I think this is kind of ridiculous, right? Like if our colleagues just said, well, I thought, a demon visited me last night, and he suggested that somehow we would not take it seriously. So, so I wanted to maybe signal straight off the bat that I'm not a Popperian. Yeah, okay. But so now I'm just characterizing the clearest difference here between these two schools in Chinese historical phonology is the treatment of negative evidence, where the Baxter Cigar, the Popperians are fine with it, but the Peking school is not. And I will say, in my more Baconian moments, and I don't know, it's unfair to him, but I have Craig in mind here. So I'll say, geologists don't ask themselves when they're in a valley, why is there no mountain here? Yeah. Yeah. Anyhow, let's get back on track here. So, summing up, we have two schools of thought. Yeah, Baxter Cigar, who like positive evidence and negative evidence. And then there are critics who like positive evidence only, and I'm going to call them the Popperians and the Baconians. Yeah. So then if we turn to the literature, both Baconianism and Popperianism have been kind of very widely criticized. And one thing I find kind of, maybe it's unfair to my colleagues, but naive is here is out in these review articles or something, is playing out a philosophical debate where both sides are relatively innocent of the existing philosophical literature. Yeah. So I'm going to speed through the criticisms of empiricism because my instinct is most of you are not naive empiricists. Yeah. I think how do I say, Popperianism is a more salient deviation in current academia than Baconianism. But if I'm wrong, then and you're still a Baconian after this slide, then you can talk to me afterwards. Yeah. So first of all, the problem of induction already pointed out by Hume, which is like if I can throw a ball and it follows a parabola, I do it 1,000,000 times. Kind of epistemologically, I still don't have any warrant to think that the next time it will be a parabola. Yeah. So there's no data itself doesn't warrant generalization. Yeah. And then also, there's no pure observations. Like any. I mean, there's a whole literature about this. Kant, Sellers, Kuhn, all make the point that if I'm a human being who knows language, I already have a biological and cognitive apparatus that's already mediating experience. Yeah. And then also just in terms of child psychology, if we start with Locke, the kind of classic empiricist, oh, you see red patches, and then you say, oh, maybe this is an academic gown once I sort of knit together some red patches in my conceptual apparatus. It's just not how children learn. They see, medium-sized dry goods kind of straight off the bat. And so the upshot is, let's not be Baconians. But how about Popperianism? Well, here I don't know. I find it easier to talk through some examples than to mount a philosophical critique. So I'm going to show that the Earth does not rotate on its axis, and that the Earth does not revolve around the Sun, following a nice Popperian methodology. Okay. So if the Earth rotates, especially it has to rotate very rapidly, right, to get all the way around in one day, then that means the ground is going all the time, right? So it means if I have a high tower and I drop a ball, the ball should shoot off in the direction opposite to the direction of the rotation of the Earth. Yeah, that's the prediction that the theory would make, and then we test it, and it's falsified because the ball goes straight down. So we must reject the theory because it's made a prediction and we falsified it. And then similarly, if the Earth goes around the Sun, the distance from where the Earth is in January and where the Earth is in July is very far. So the angle between two stars observed from the Earth should change. It should be, in this example, in January, it's a small angle between the two stars, and then in July, it's a large angle between the two stars. This is called stellar parallaxis, and it doesn't happen. At least it doesn't happen unless you have an awfully good microscope. Yeah, but it certainly didn't happen in the 16th century. So if, Mr. Galileo comes along and says, oh, I think the Earth goes around the Sun, you say, we tested your hypothesis, and it makes a false prediction, so we can reject it. Yeah, so we hypothesize that the Earth turns on its axis, and it's falsified. We hypothesize that the Earth goes around the Sun, and it's falsified. So I would say that the hypothetico-deductive method is not very promising. Yeah. And now I quote from Paul Feyerabend, who is a PhD student of Karl Popper's, and he said, the idea of the motion of the Earth was in big trouble, or, if you will, refuted. It could survive only if it was treated with kindness. And I think some of you are probably treating these theories with kindness right now in your minds, yeah? But if it could be treated with kindness, so could the older system. Okay, so which do we go with? Do we go with Bacon or do we go with Popper? Yeah. Well, I think that we would all, I don't know, I would appeal that there's a kind of understandable impulse in both cases. So in the Baconian, it's that observations drive discovery. And in Popperian side, it's that conjectures should be tested and they should be tested hard, right? But observation is always theory-laden, and most theories are either unfalsifiable or trivially falsified. So those are the, that's my summing up of the kind of pros and cons of both philosophical positions. So how do we, what philosophy of science should we have if it's not Bacon or Popper, yeah? Well, I'm going to suggest that maybe it's the philosophy of Karl Marx. So, this next section I'm calling the double movement, and then I'll talk through Marx's philosophy of science. So in step one, we start with concrete appearance. I think this is in the Grundrisse. We'll see the citation at the end. But so it seems to be correct to begin with the real and the concrete. Thus, to begin in economics with, for example, population. That's move one. Then move two, ever thinner abstraction. So, however, population is an abstraction if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. If I were to begin with the population, this would be a chaotic conception, Vorstellung, of the whole, and I would then, by means of further determinations, move analytically towards ever more simple concepts, Begriff, from the imagined concrete towards ever thinner abstractions until I had arrived at the simplest determinations. So that's the second move, and this is, as you can see, a kind of Baconian move, right? And then in the third, towards an ever richer totality. So from there, the journey would have to be retraced until I had finally arrived at the population again, but this time not as a chaotic conception of a whole, but of a rich totality of many determinations. The method of rising from the abstract to the concrete, and that's in bold because that's sort of, I don't know, in the literature that this is the method of rising from the abstract to the concrete. It's kind of Marx's philosophy of science. Is the only way in which thought appropriates the concrete, reproduces it as the concrete in the mind. Okay, so there are two economists at Amherst, Wolff and Resnick, who have kind of schematized, inspired by Althusser, have schematized this as we go from the concrete real to abstraction, and then from abstraction to the thought concrete. All right. So now I just want to give credit where credit is due. This double movement of kind of combining, if you like, empiricism with deductivism is not Marx's invention. So here's a quote from Isaac Newton, and I won't read it, but in his terminology we have analysis, which goes from phenomena to forces, right, thinking about physics, and then synthesis, which is going from forces to other phenomena. So if you just started with some phenomena and you ended up at those phenomena, you're not doing particularly good science. But if you start from some phenomena, make a theory, and that predicts other phenomena, then you're, then you're cooking with gas. Yeah, okay. Now, there's an existing body of literature that I think persuasively shows that this kind of double movement is inherited through a scientific tradition to Newton that goes back to Robert Grosseteste, who was the first chancellor of Oxford University in the 13th century. I've looked at his commentary. This is in those days, the way people wrote books was by commenting on other things. So this is his commentary on the posterior analytics of Aristotle, and I can't find a kind of snappy quote. But you do get this kind of vibe from him. So, and in his terminology, we have resolutio, which is moving from effects to causes, and compositio, which is moving from causes to effects. Yeah, and then he was writing a commentary on the posterior analytics, so it won't be any surprise that this similar sort of double movement goes back to Aristotle, and in Aristotle's terminology, it's epagoge, going from appearances to causes, and apodeixis, going from causes to appearances. And you see that there is a real difference between how these double movements are being conceptualized, right? Is phenomena to forces, forces to other phenomena, effects to causes, causes to effects, or appearances to causes and causes to appearances? And I would actually say that Aristotle's terminology is kind of more, to be anachronistic, more Hegelian, and and as we'll see, more Marxist. But anyhow, you might be worried that if Aristotle, Newton, or Aristotle, Grosseteste, Newton, and Marx all agree on scientific methodology, it's a problem that they have very different views about the physical world, for instance, yeah? So I think maybe this is the right philosophy of science to have, this kind of embracing of the Popperian and the Baconian moments in some sort of larger totality, but it's maybe underspecified still, right? So I want to then look at least one concrete case of how science actually works. And I am going to use the work of Urbain Le Verrier. So he was a physicist, and he was a Newtonian, and he noticed, these were known problems in the day, right? But he noticed that, that there were problems with Newton's theory, and he tried to solve those problems in Newton's framework, and once he did it and it worked, and once he did it and it didn't work. So let's go first with when it did work. So he notices that Uranus deviates from what Newton would predict in terms of its orbit around the sun. So, Newtonian theory would predict one thing, and it's a little bit off from that. So then he said, well, maybe there's another planet that's kind of exerting gravity on Uranus and pulling it a little bit out of its orbit. And then was able to predict where this other planet should be observed in the sky, and lo and behold, there was Neptune. So this is kind of Popperianism at its best, in a sense, right? Like, have a theory makes a prediction, test the prediction, and lo and behold, you've found another planet. And then he thought, well, this is working well, so let's try it again. So Mercury also doesn't quite work the way Newton would have it work. So then he said, okay, I'm going to predict another planet between the Sun and Mercury. It's called Vulcan, and let's say nobody has found it yet. Yeah. So what I think is nice about this example is it means, you can't really legislate once and for all scientific methodology, right? Because the same method that leads to the discovery of Neptune fails to lead to the discovery of Vulcan. Now, of course, what's it called? We have a fancy name for it. Yeah, the perihelion precession of Mercury has been explained, but it's been explained by Einstein's general theory of relativity and not by Vulcan. And now I think it's worth mentioning, and this is sort of what I will go on about in the next section of the lecture, that in a certain sense, Newtonian physics is a subcase of Einsteinian physics at weak fields and low velocities, although actually the meaning of a lot of the terms, like what is mass, what is gravity, have changed. So it's not quite fair to say that Newton is a subcase of Einstein. So now I have kind of schematized what I think we've learned from this example, and it's what I call the inducto-dogmatic method. So it's exact opposite of the hypothetico-deductive method, right? So the inducto-dogmatic method is you start with observations, you notice a pattern, and then you assume that you notice a pattern because there's a real phenomenon there. And that's your explanatory mechanism. And then you make predictions, you test, and then either your hypothesis is confirmed, in which case you stick with your hypothesis, or your hypothesis is not confirmed, in which case you stick with your hypothesis. And that's the dogmatic side, yeah? So I just want to point out here that this dogmatism is not irrational. And, if people, criticize you for being dogmatic, you should embrace that criticism, I think. Because it protects the theory as it accumulates successes, yeah? So if we had been real Popperians, so Galileo would say, I think maybe the Earth turns on its axis. We would say, no, it's wrong. Yeah. So you need to, believe despite the evidence. But then, it does sometimes happen that it's time to give up a dogma, and how, when does that happen, right? So usually it happens late. not early. So I think don't go around trying to abandon dogmas. Yeah, it's something that kind of will happen naturally. Repairs become increasingly ad hoc. The framework stops generating new successes, and a rival theory is able to redescribe the successes of the preceding theory, resolving the anomaly in fewer patches. So this is how we get from Le Verrier to Einstein. And I will call it Aufhebung. Yeah. So, so from a crisis to a space of solutions, anomalies alone do not prompt a new theory. Instead, our crisis has to ripen. Yeah, we give Galileo a chance to say, actually, the ball is still rotating with the Earth while it's falling. You know, but then eventually there's a crisis, and when the crisis arrives, you know, this is I don't know, may sound a little mystical, but the solution space will already exist with things like new data, new measurements, new instruments, new formalisms, new mathematics. And I think this is, I think maybe I'm kind of using this quote in a context that it's not usually used, but this is another quote from Marx, from the Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy. Mankind thus inevitably sets itself only such tasks as it is able to solve, since closer examination will always show that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution are already present, or at least in the course of formation. And to me, the greatest example of this is climate change, right? Which is like the moment you have the science to understand what, you know, anthropogenic climate change is, you already have the, let's say, material conditions to solve it. You may not have the socio-political conditions to solve it, but there is a kind of, if you like, a natural logic to the unfolding of the material social totality, such that the timing of these crises is kind of I don't know, conditioned by laws. Yeah. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with, you know, Aufhebung as a piece of, you know, Hegelian jargon. But the nice thing about it, as a German word, it means cancel, it means preserve, it means lift up. Actually, one of the best English translations that I've seen attempted is suspension, because suspension could be like the London subway is suspended. Yeah, it means it's gone, it's not there. Yeah, but also in music, a suspension means, you know, a note being held for a long time. So this kind of ambiguity is there in suspension. Yeah, but anyhow, so a new theory is not. What do I say here? A theory does not simply discard the old one, saying, you know, oh, you're wrong, I'm right. Yeah. Instead, it explains kind of the work that the old theory did. It restricts the old theory to a certain domain or limiting case, and it redescribes the anomalies as a consequence of the new theory, right? So Newtonian gravity is preserved as an approximation, but its basic semantic categories are transformed, like I was saying before. So this is, you know, Einsteinian physics is an Aufhebung of Newtonian physics. Yeah, and I think that this notion of Aufhebung helps us deal with one of the criticisms of Kuhn, which is sort of, well, if there's no real sure scientific method, and it's just a sociology of scientists where, like, you know, the younger crowd is tired of the theory of their elders, and, you know, anything goes, then how can we, you know, reassure ourselves that humanity is making progress? Yeah, and I'm not sure that, I don't know, I'm not sure that that's a psychological need that we should always feel obliged to satisfy. But if you're confronted with two theories and you're not sure which one to believe in, maybe you should consider which one has aufgehoben the other one. Yeah, and the way I find, or let's say. Now I'm just going to say the same thing in other words, but with less German, maybe. I'm going to call this forgiveness. Yeah. So Aufheben as refutation. Yeah. And then also Aufheben, you know, I don't know, it is applied in situations other than the philosophy of science. So I think I'm going to try and use, you know, forgiveness as the kind of implementation of Aufhebung in the philosophy of science. And I'm relying here on the work of Robert Brandom at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'll just read these things. So he's a Hegelian. He's a sort of analytic Hegelian, and actually, like, I don't know, one way of understanding Anglophone philosophy, I think, is that kind of around 1900, they got sick of Hegelianism because it just sounded like mumbo-jumbo, and wanted to be very rigorous, and then went back to Locke, and sort of, Russell, and to some extent Wittgenstein are sort of Lockean, analytical Lockeans, and then, Sellers saw himself explicitly as an analytical Kantian, and finally the analytical tradition has caught up with Hegel in the person of Robert Brandom. Yeah. So then I sort of hope that I will live to see the analytical Marx. Yeah. We do have a tradition called analytical Marxism, but it's better not spoken of, I would say. Anyhow, so I'll just read these quotes. So recollection rationalizes a course of experience by retroactively redescribing it so as to exhibit its expressive, to exhibit it as expressively progressive. And so this is his notion of recollective rationality, where, being rational basically has to do with being able to tell a story about how your predecessors were making an advance. Yeah? And forgiveness, this is his turn, is the magnanimous recognitive stance that takes a confessed failure and resituates it inside a reconstructed trajectory. Yeah? So anyhow, that's what he says. So I think forgiveness is a stronger form of refutation, right? So rather than just saying, reasons for my view and reasons against your view, I can say what was right in what was wrong, and I think the successor can earn some authority from this, not merely by rejecting its predecessor, but by seeing its predecessor as a necessary and intelligible stage. Yeah. Okay. So I think we can kind of distinguish. I'm going to need to distinguish in any case two kinds of forgiveness. So within a tradition and across traditions, and a little bit sort of bending my German terminology, but I think it's warranted. I'm going to call these Erinnerung and Aufhebung. So in the case of Erinnerung, we're talking about our forebears, and we're explicating what we think they meant to say. Yeah? They used maybe a different terminology, they had different instruments than us. So another task that we have is to explain why they couldn't say things as well as we can now say them. Yeah? So we credit our forebears with our ideas, and then we historically account for the constraints, the material social constraints that prevented them from realizing their own ideas as fully as we now realize them. Yeah? And actually, I would say, personally, in academic writing, I really like it. Whenever you have an idea, you should find, some Jesuit in the 17th century who can be understood as having had that idea, and then you cite them, yeah, and you criticize other people for not knowing about them. Yeah. Okay, but across traditions, the interlocutor is the rival, and we explain why they saw what they saw, but how that is, appearance that has misled them. Yeah. So someone who thinks the Earth is flat, they live in, I don't know, Arizona or something. They look around, they say, oh, it looks flat. Yeah. So if I'm going to believe the world is round, I have to account for how it can look flat. Yeah. Okay. So in Kuhn's terminology, which I think people will generally be familiar with, I think this difference between sort of forgiveness inside a tradition and forgiveness outside a tradition is normal science versus scientific revolution. So I don't know, I assume, some of you at least are familiar with Kuhn, so I move on for that. So I would like to argue that Karl Marx is a master of forgiveness, maybe despite his acerbic prose style. Within a tradition, this is the tradition of classical political economy, starting with William Petty, then going to Adam Smith, and then David Ricardo, where he treats each of his predecessors in classical political economy as necessary but constrained steps in progress. Yeah, But then across traditions, we would have the vulgar economists who correctly characterize appearance, but are misled by it to not see the essence of matters. Okay. So in an earlier version of, sort of when I'm practicing this, now I sort of wanted to talk for a couple hours about classical political economy, and I've decided that's not a good idea. Yeah. So probably everyone knows who Adam Smith is. You may not know that he thought there should be a maximum interest rate. Yeah, anyhow. What I do want to say is a word about William Petty, because I think he should be better known in Ireland. He was a doctor who is credited by Marx as the founder of classical political economy, in particular as one of the early proponents of the labor theory of value, and he is also the man who did the land survey of Ireland after the Cromwellian Wars, in which the land was, given to the English. So he did that in a book called The Political Arithmetic of Ireland. So I think, I don't know, in the economics department, they should think about how, I don't know, the relationship between economics as a science and the history of land surveying in Ireland. Okay, so I just wanted to stop and, give credit where credit was due to William Petty. And then I move on to the vulgar economists, who, the ones Marx was engaging with are listed on the right. None of them are particularly well known, I think, anymore. But they had a factor theory of value. So value is produced by land, labor, and capital being brought together. And Marx wasn't around when you had like Leon Walras and the so-called marginalists, but the marginalists are also factor theorists. So I think it's pretty clear that neoclassical economists would be seen by Marx as vulgar economics. Right. So, and then he points out, which I just think is a funny phrase, that the ontological status of these three things are heterogeneous, and he compares it to lawyers' fees, beetroot, and music. And I think that, this is called the Trinity formula. So I think if there were like, I don't know, a Marxist society at Trinity, it should be called lawyer fees, beetroot, and music. Yeah. So now I take a quick look at how Marx forgives vulgar economics. And I'm not going to go through the details because it took him about 2,000 pages to do that. So the essence is the surplus, is that surplus value comes from surplus labor time, right? If you run a factory, the way you get rich is by having employees. And actually, I'll say that Kropotkin has a wonderful discovery of, like, let's say that that wealth comes from working hard and playing fair. Then you would be a shoemaker and you would make shoes as fast as you can, and you might, save up enough to retire. Yeah, but at some point, if you're actually going to be a rich shoemaker, you're going to have to start hiring other people. Yeah. So anyhow, Kropotkin, who used that sort of as an argument in favor of the labor theory of value. But I'm not here to defend the labor theory of value. I'll just say Marx articulates the labor theory of value in Capital Volume 1, and in Capital Volume 3, he gets to the Trinity formula and explains how his version of the labor theory of value predicts the factors of production theory of value. Yeah, so that's why it's important to read to the end of books. Yeah. So the factor theory is true as an appearance, and in fact is a prediction of his theory, but it's false as essence in exactly the same way that the relationship between Newton and Einstein, right? So I want to argue that the progress in science can be recognized as an asymmetric capacity to forgive. So Einstein can forgive Newton, but Newton can't forgive Einstein. And if we're talking about economics, Marx can forgive factor theorists, But they, and these are people, factor theorists subsequent to Marx who have criticized him, Bumbaverk, Samuelson, they can't forgive Marx. So I think when you're looking, at least for me, you know, if I'm looking at someone who wasn't trained as an economist, this kind of asymmetry in forgiveness capacity, I think it's a useful way of forming a view about which scientific theory is more progressive. So now I've gotten kind of far from uvulars in Old Chinese. And this is where in the summer I was hoping to show how the Baxter cigar system forgives the Peking school, yeah? But actually that's a lot of work for me to do there. So I'll just say that's my homework, yeah? So as a card-carrying, you know, American, I somehow believe in the uvular hypothesis, but I have a lot of work to do to convince myself that it is the superior theory, the aufgehobene theory. And I think that there are two concrete things that need to be done there. One is to concretely reproduce the Peking analysis as a consequence of the Baxter cigar analysis, and I would propose to do this using certain formal tools. In particular, with a collaborator in London, we're using network theory for this. And then the other thing to do is a task in intellectual history, which is to understand the history of Chinese linguistics in China, which came out of an intellectual tradition independent of the Western European intellectual tradition, from especially the Qing dynasty, so sort of 17th century on, to Wang Li, who I think died in the 80s. I think there's sort of the Wang Li school is the Chinese internal tradition that in some ways goes back, you know, as old as the hills, but let's say it's particularly a kind of late 18th century thing. And I have, in fact, applied to Research Ireland for a project to study the history of Chinese phonology in terms of an academic discipline, and in particular, the phenomenon of multiple researchers coming up with the same analysis at the same time, like Leibniz and Newton coming up with the calculus at the same time. This happened twice in the history of Chinese, although the history of the study of Chinese. But actually, I'm happy to say that in the 60s, when a Russian, a Chinese scholar, and an American came up with the same vowel theory, they were at pains to say, "Oh no, he got there before I did." Yeah, very, very different than Newton. But anyhow, we were meant to have heard back from Research Island, but they were oversubscribed. So maybe you can keep your fingers crossed for me, and maybe we'll hear in March. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.